first in just a 5-part series on questions that people may have. Tonight, our question is there evidence for the existence of God? Before I say too much about it, just briefly around your tables, discuss. How would you respond to someone who says, I don't believe in God because there's no proof? I guess I'd say that if you're a believer, if you believe in God, then that is actually a question that you've dealt with in some way, even if you weren't consciously saying, what are the evidences for God? Because if you believe in something, it's because you believe that it's real. If you believe in God, you believe that God is real, and there must have been something, in a sense, that has convinced you to believe that you're not crazy or deluded by believing that there is a God, that God is real.
Isn't there a question then that might be, yes, but which God? The God of Islam or Buddha or...
Yeah, excellent point, and we're going to get to that in a little while, actually. Yeah. So hold that thought, because that's...
Some of us,
yeah.
it's like we accepted the whole Christian story, which tells us not just that there's God, but that Jesus is the incarnation of that God and a whole lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas this stuff here is more specifically just the basic idea of a creator without necessarily adding extra information such as the Christian gospel.
Yeah. So we will actually get to that tonight, that difference there. But first we're going to start with we're going to look at things from the world's perspective, try and just get into the mind of a non-believer, someone who says, I don't believe in God. It might be that they say, I believe there is no God, or they might be agnostic and say, well, I just don't know, or I don't think you can know, or whatever their perspective is. We need to kind of think, well, why would someone ask this question in the first place? Is there evidence for the existence of God? Now, often it's framed as an objection rather than a question. I don't believe in God because there's no proof. And probably 9 times out of 10, if someone frames it as a statement instead of a question, they're probably not actually wanting you to give them an answer. They're not actually open to conversation or discussion. They're asserting their view, and they're not necessarily ready to listen. But that doesn't mean that we don't give a response, because we should trust that if there's making that statement to a Christian, then God has a reason behind that, and he may want to be using us to bring them to a knowledge of himself. Just make sure this sound is on. I'm just going to watch a very short clip of probably the world's most famous atheist.
So after listening to all this, I was just a bit confused about what is your belief on God, because I think it is right to say that we need to prove things before we believe in them. So I come to the conclusion that we don't know if God exists or not. Is that the same conclusion you share?
Yes. We don't know for certain if leprechauns exist, fairies exist, hobgoblins exist. We don't know all sorts of things, and until we do, then we take the best evidence that we have, and we don't waste our time believing in things for which there is no positive reason to think that they do exist. We cannot disprove the existence of Thor and Odin and Jupiter and Zeus, Mithras, etc. But until there's any positive evidence for them, we don't waste our time with them.
Okay. I don't know what you thought about his answer, but obviously the audience there thought that was pretty clever of him. I guess the thing with guys like Richard Dawkins and others is they're very good at articulating their answers, aren't they? So on one hand, you might sit there and say, wow, what he just said was so cohesive and made a lot of sense, therefore I'll take on board what he's saying. Or it may be that you sit there and think, I actually didn't understand what he said on a very intellectual level, but that's part of his strategy, because he knows people will think, oh, well, Richard Dawkins obviously is much more intelligent than me. I don't even understand what he's saying, so that must mean he must be right, because he's the clever scientist. So I'll just go along with that assertion. But it's basically saying the burden of proof for God's existence is on those who say that God exists. Unless you can present positive evidence that there is a God, then we shouldn't waste our time on even thinking about God, let alone the Christian God, let alone these ancient Greek gods that no one even believes in anymore anyway. Now, it's important for us to realise, though, that this objection to the existence of God is actually a fairly recent modern thing. It's really been prevalent since the time of the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century onwards. And out of the Enlightenment, the scientific approach became the standard. In other words, something can only be considered true if it can be observed. So you have to do the experiment in a laboratory, to repeat it, to verify, yes, it's actually true. Or it can be deduced by logic. So it's like mathematics. You can use the logic to say this must be the case because the laws of maths or so on say it must be true. That's kind of the scientific approach, and it's a relatively modern approach in the last few centuries. This kind of atheism that demands proof for God is actually unknown in the Bible. Not that the Bible is ignorant of it, but it wasn't actually a question for ancient people. In fact, for most of human history, and in fact even today in most of the world, this isn't even a question or an objection. So it's actually kind of this modern atheistic approach is actually quite arrogant, really, because what it says is there's a minority of people today, because if you go around the world and ask people, do you believe in God or spiritual things or something more than the material world, the majority of the world's population will say yes. Now, they might be Muslims or Hindus or Christians or whatever, but it's actually a minority of human beings today who say there is no God and we need evidence before we believe. And for most of human history, it's been the case. So it's a little bit, there's a bit of arrogance there to say we are the chosen elite few who know better than every other human being that's ever lived and lives today. In that sense. So while they say the burden of proof is on us as believers to prove to them that God exists, I think it's actually reverse. If someone pops up with a new idea and says, hey, guess what? There is no God. There is no spiritual realm. Well, they've got the new idea. The burden of proof is actually on them, isn't it? To show beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is no God, spiritual world, or anything beyond the material world.
For God's people in the Old Testament, they didn't just believe there was a God out there. They believed our God is the real one and all the other ones aren't the real thing. And that is a kind of specific one that I guess has some burden of proof. But,
well, that brings us to what was raised a bit earlier. So in the ancient world, in most of the world, and in the biblical world, we don't actually see this question directly addressed, because no one in the ancient world, in the biblical world, was an atheist in that sense. The question wasn't so much, is there a God or not? It is, well, whose God? Either whose God is the most powerful amongst the gods, so which God should we choose amongst all the options? Or with the Jews, the Israelites who came up with this, not came up, they appeared on the scene, wasn't their invention, but they appeared on the scene in that world and said, actually, no, there is only one God and he is the only one true God. So what's being communicated in the scriptures isn't, hey, God saying, hey, look, I exist. It's more, I am the Lord, I am the one true God, and all the other gods are figments of people's imaginations or evil spiritual forces and so on. So when we're dealing with kind of modern skeptics, we can't think that we can just go to the Bible and say, here's irrefutable proof from the Bible that God exists in that sense. I heard a story recently about a non-Christian parent who sent their child to Sunday school at church, and this child came out, and the dad said, "Oh, so what did you learn about in Sunday school?" And the child said, "Oh, it was all about this group of people who were slaves, and there was a man who brought them out of slavery. So they came out and they got their hoses and they sucked all the water out of the sea so that they could get across. And then the army was chasing them, but then the jet fighters flew over and bombed them all and killed their enemies. And the father said, "Oh, is that really what you were taught?" And the child said, "Well, no, but you wouldn't actually believe what really happened." But we can face that temptation to think, okay, I've got someone who's a non-believer, and I've got to somehow try and convince them. I've got to present things in a way that will make it sound believable to them, so that they can use their intellect, or that they can actually believe. So our temptation is that we dumb it down, or we simplify it too much, or we take out the bits of what we're saying that sound a bit too spiritual or supernatural or even offensive, in that attempt to try and get people to believe it. But really, what we'll see a bit later is we actually have to have a confidence in God and His Word to actually do the work in a person's heart to lead them to true faith. It's not an intellectual process where someone by their own ability or knowledge or understanding becomes a true believer in God. It's actually the work of God in them. What we're going to do just very quickly, again still putting ourselves in the mind of the non-believer, is look at some ways that philosophers have tried to deal with that question: is there evidence for God? And we're just going to go through very quickly these things, and the risk with explaining something in a few sentences is that you risk slightly misrepresenting or not giving the whole story. But I want to spend a short amount of time on this and a longer amount of time actually looking at the biblical answer to this question. So one of the arguments from philosophers is called the cosmological argument, and there's two ways to think about that. The first is the argument from contingency, which means one thing depends upon another. And what this argument says is the universe doesn't exist of itself. right? If you see something, if you see that chair there, you can ask the question, why is the chair there? And the answer is, well, it's there because Sukyong put it there. So the chair being there is dependent upon Sukyong, his actions of putting the chair there. And so this argument says, well, the same thing that we ask about that chair can be asked of the universe. Why is the universe here? What is the reason for the universe existing? And this argument says, well, God is the reason the universe exists. I said we're going to be quick, so if you didn't quite get that, then you can Google all this and you'll find more detail of it. This other aspect of a cosmological, so cosmos means the universe, so it's kind of looking at the fact that the universe and us are here as a evidence for God. The second approach is that of origins or beginnings. So it says the universe had a beginning, and apparently most scientists would maintain, yes, it's clear from the evidence that there was a beginning point for our universe. Therefore, what caused the universe to come into existence? The answer is, well, there must be a first cause. There must be a God who himself has always existed and doesn't have a beginning himself. The third approach is the moral approach or the ethical approach. I should have said ethical so that all these words end with ical anyway. So the moral approach says we as human beings know that there is such a thing as right and wrong, good and evil, and we live our lives even Richard Dawkins lives his life according to certain moral ethical standards. But this argument says, well, moral values require a ultimate standard for morality. If there is no God, then there is actually no such thing as right and wrong, good or evil, and it wouldn't even matter if I took out a gun now and shot you all, and there's nothing wrong with that. So the fact that we know there is a moral values is evidence for God. Fourth one is teleological. That comes from the Greek word telos, which means completion or perfection or purpose. So things are moving towards a goal. That's how we see it in the Bible. But this teleological approach looks at the fine-tuning of the world and says because things are the way they are, that points to an intelligent designer who made it this way. That's quite a popular approach today. A lot of Christians will be using this approach. I personally think there's a few problems with it, but things like they might say, well, look at just the design or the way a human being is structured. Look at the way the universe operates. Look at the fact that the Earth just happens to be exactly in the habitable zone of distance from the sun. All those kind of things that say, wow, the fact that everything is so finely tuned.
And there's lots of those at the subatomic kind of level. So.
Yeah. It's just incredible. That says, well, therefore, just as we would look at this laptop and say, this didn't happen by chance, someone made it, therefore there must be a creator of the world. And then the fifth one, called the ontological argument, and for me this is the one that kind of bends my mind a bit more. I still struggle sometimes to get my head around it a bit. The ontological argument says the fact that God's existence is possible makes it probable. And there's a whole chain of logic that goes with that, but it's kind of like saying, well, the fact that we as human beings are even debating whether or not God exists points to the probable existence of God. And in that little quote from C.S. Lewis, he kind of employs this argument where he says, well, if you're thirsty, that implies the existence of water. So the fact that we say there is a possibility, it's possible for God to exist, is an indication that it's likely that God does exist, because we have this, we even have the concept of God exists in that sense. I think that's what that's saying, but like I said, it's probably out of these five, it's the one that's most based on this process of logical reasoning, which some of us might find hard to get our head around. So that's what philosophers over centuries have said, even back to the 10th century. These are the kind of arguments that philosophers have come up with. Just quickly, the pros and cons of that kind of approach. It's helpful to know a bit about what philosophers are saying, because they can be useful starting points. It may be that the person we're speaking to is actually familiar with some of these arguments. So if we know a little bit about it, it means we can actually start engaging with people on the level that they're at. Understanding what philosophers have said over the centuries can help us just to understand the modern mind and the way that non-believers are thinking, because those are the philosophical ideas that have actually shaped the way that we think in the world today. The problem, though, with that kind of philosophical approach is that it's solely an intellectual level. So it's all just, like the ontological idea. I don't know if you guys even got it. Like I said, I'm still struggling. So it's like it's purely a cerebral, intellectual approach. And ultimately, all that philosophy can do is lead to deism. Deism is the view that says, well, yes, there is a God, but God, he made the world, but he's left us to our own devices. He's distant, he's unknowable, he's, if it's even a he, impersonal. So philosophy can never actually lead someone into actually knowing God. And philosophy doesn't give us answers to the real questions that we actually have to, every human being deals with where the rubber hits the road. Questions of meaning, identity, who am I, suffering, evil, how do we make sense of all of the things that come with us living in the world today. You can have an intellectual belief that, okay, according to logic, there must be a God, but how does that actually help you get up in the morning and live your life and face the challenges that we face as human beings? Let's look at 1 Corinthians 1, 18 to 25. Can someone read that out for us, please?
The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since, in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But for those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men.
Okay, so Paul just lays it out there. Basically, he says it much better than what I've been trying to say it to me. In the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom. And by that he's saying they may have ideas about God, but you cannot actually come to know God in a relational way through wisdom. And that the word for wisdom there is the same word for philosophy. You can't know God through philosophy and wisdom.